Good morning, folks. Baz here. So, today is another Let's Talk, and today's conversation is about racism and slavery, mostly slavery. Um, it's constantly a topic in today's society as to what happened in slave times in America, and who's responsible for what, and who should pay reparations and whatnot. And I don't think a lot of people understand. For one, slavery ended in 1865. We are pushing up on 200 years since, right? I mean, 2065 is a far ways away, but it's still closer than 1865 was, right? So we're coming on 200 years. So that's a long time ago, which means anyone that had anything to do with that back then, they're long gone. They done died, you know? If someone is still alive from that time, that person is a living historical record. I don't know. But now I'm not trying to minimize it by saying it's over and it ended a long time ago. What I mean is, the people today, our the people who ended up being descendants of slaves, they're not suffering any true brunt of what happened to their ancestors, what happened to our ancestors. No one today is being faced with the same type of racism and bigotry that they were dealt with back then, you know. But when it comes to the topic of slavery, I think people misunderstand a couple of things because people seem to think that only America had slaves. Whenever the topic comes up, they treat it as though it's this new thing or that America invented when it wasn't, you know. So let's bring it back, like really, really far back. If anything, slavery has been around as long as mankind has been around. They say prostitution was the world's first form of market, first commerce, form of commerce. But slavery was just along with that, you know. Um, you could watch shows like Spartacus and whatnot. Yes, they dramatize a lot of things for the aspect of Hollywood and whatnot, but there's a lot of truth to it. You know, there were places that people will go to fetch slaves, and it could have been in Romans, it could have been Britannic, could have been Gaul, it could have been Thrace, it could have been anywhere. Um, Usually, what happened was the people who were sold into slavery were people whose villages or cities were raided, and they became trophies of war. Right? I'm not saying it's a good thing by any means, but that's really what it was. It had nothing to do with race. Um, it could have had something to do with nationality. For instance, if Rome was going to war with Gallia, and then the Gauls were lost, and they had to give some people over. It could have been a situation like that, but it wasn't necessarily a racist situation. Well, it's the slavery. It's just how things were, and it wasn't even strictly Europeans who were dealing with slaves. You had slave trade across from Africa to Asia to Europe. So it goes back a really far way. The Egyptians had slaves, the Romans had slaves, the Greeks had slaves, all over had slaves. The difference between our slaves and the slaves that we had in America and the slavery that was done in those times was, I think, to some degree, there was a touch of cruelty done towards our slaves. There was a little bit. Is, the stories that were passed on were a little bit more disturbing and disgusting. Whereas, for instance, in Rome, now not every slave owner was a good slave owner, but in Rome, there were some slave owners that prided themselves on, being good slave owners. Not saying that makes it okay for them to be slave owners, but just that they were decent human beings to the people that they owned. I guess you could, in a way of saying, um, their slaves didn't go unkept. They were bathed regularly. They wore nice things. They weren't mistreated. They're regarded very highly. Um, Marcus Crassus is one of those people from the old Roman world who is known for being very generous and thoughtful, respectful towards his slaves. if I'm not mistaken, when it came to quelling the slave rebellion that was brought on by Spartacus, Crassus actually took his training with swordsmanship from a slave, not from some master swordsman, not from some Roman military, but from a slave who had seen his own fair share of battle in the arena. His take was, if I'm going to defeat these guys, I need to be able to fight like them. I need to understand how they fight. And he admired them. He admired their power. Even though he knew it would be his job to stop Spartacus, he still admired that what Spartacus had done, right? But now, fast forward to the transatlantic slave trade, and I think there's several misconceptions there, several misunderstandings there. It's made to seem as though the Europeans just stormed Africa's lands and started rounding people up, as those Spanish and English people were just running up the shores and taking nets and just scooping motherfuckers up and putting them on their ships. And that's not what was happening. The same system that was happening in Europe and in Persia and anywhere else was what was happening in Africa. One tribe of people went to war with another tribe, and whoever lost, their people were either killed or they made up as slaves for slave trade. And so the people that were bought in West Africa, they were people who were already caught. You know, the Europeans didn't have to go hunting for them. They were already hunted for and were already brought to a market for trading. Furthermore, the English people, all the Europeans in general, they actually feared going inland of Africa because of the many diseases that they weren't inoculated to, measles, malaria, and whatnot. There's probably more that I don't know of, but they were afraid of getting illnesses, and oftentimes on the ship ride backs over towards the west, some people would fall sick because of having to handle these people who had their own illnesses and their own sicknesses. So it wasn't like the white man was in control of it all. Africans sold their own people, and I watched different debates online. Um, there's that one podcast with that Andrew and Brian gentlemen, and they usually bring on OnlyFans models, and they have their own political debates. And one of them came on that, and I was watching someone's reaction to it, and the brother was an African. He himself was like, "Bro, it's the Africans who sold the Africans. Like, y'all don't know your history." It's the truth. A lot of people don't really know their history. They don't realize that not all of America was pro-slavery. A lot of America was actually against it, and that's where your dividing lines for state votes became a thing. Is the 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 push for power, push for the majority when it came to the different states. Um, each state had its own vote in the overall rule, so neither side wanted to be outnumbered. If the Union side had 12 states on their side, well, the Confederate side wanted 12 states at least, or 13 on their side to make it even. Now, when it came to the Civil War, people forget how many people lost their lives to free the slaves. When you look at the numbers of the aftermath, the Union died like 3 times as amount as Confederate soldiers. For every one person that was dying from the Confederate side to keep slavery, there was 3 men dying from the Union side to free the slaves. Granted, mostly because of people like Ulysses S. Grant, who had gotten the nickname the Butcher because his method of winning was constantly throwing more and more bodies at his enemies. He was going to push his way to victory, and he did. Um, did it piss some people off from the North who were just losing a lot of their men? Yeah, but there was a lot of people from the North who also were opposed to slavery. Um, so you had, and I point this out not just to point out that who was responsible for ending it, but the sheer amount, because it's made to seem as though all white men wanted slaves, when the fact of the matter is 3 times more white men didn't want slaves and fought to free them, died to free them, you know? Um, where this blooms in today's society, racism is everywhere, unfortunately. I don't think there will ever be getting rid of racism because prejudice always exists. For one reason or another, you always come across someone who holds a prejudice towards something. Um, it would only make sense that, unfortunately, in some areas, people hold prejudices towards others for, cultural and ethnic reasons. It's unfortunate. We don't like it, but at most, all we could do is leave those people alone and let them be by themselves in their own racism. Because truly, they're not making themselves a part of society, you know. But I think in today's society, we need to get past the racism, get past the slavery. Um, Reparations. Who do you tax to pay reparations? You know, because not every white person that lives in America today has ancestors that had anything to do with slavery. Um, Even people who came from places where they were okay with slaves. Even and if there's a white person here whose family was Spanish or English, um, it doesn't mean that your ancestors were definitely slave owners. I know for a fact mine weren't. Why? Because they half of that side is my white side, half of it is Irish, the other half is Italian. The Italian side came in 1902, if I'm not mistaken. So that was way later after slaves were free, because I'm not mistaken. Were they freed in 1865? Right? That's what I said. So 1902. That's way later. And then the Irish were held just as much as slaves. The KKK actually didn't like the Irish, not just because they weren't American, but they were also Catholic, and the KKK was anti anything that wasn't white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Um, so they weren't slave owners. If anything, there were Irish people who were indentured servants who had to work as slaves to earn their freedom here. Um, Central Park was a community for freed Irish and African slaves. It was where a lot of their houses were. And the only reason why you don't see any of this shit there now, anything remaining, is because there was a time when England was getting notoriety for having major cities with big, beautiful parks in them, London being one of them. And so um, the Americans wanted to keep up with the Joneses in that sense, decided that they were going to take down what was those homes for those Irish and those African Americans or African slaves, freed slaves, and create a park. So Central Park isn't natural; it's man-made. Some parts of it may be natural, but for the most part, it was put together by man, and houses were knocked down to have it to have what we have now. You know, um, and in today's society, the slavery that exists is not because of Americans. It's the same people who were doing the trading even back then. You know, you keep blaming the white man. The white man has nothing to do with it. The Chinese have their own slaves. There's other Asian countries that have their own slaves. If you ever seen, what was that show on Netflix? It has something to do with the sea, trying to take care of the sea, and the different ways in which mankind is destroying the sea and robbing it of all. It's not just the fish, but destroying coral reefs that took ages to grow. Within that documentary, they also included that many of these shipping companies deal in slaves. Well, not that they deal in them, but they buy slaves, and they have slaves that are on the ship that are never allowed to leave, and all they do is catch fish all day. So slavery is still going on, in its own different ways. In some ways, I'm often spoken to where I'm living as a slave. Um, the people I live with, they don't speak to me with any kind of kindness. It's not, hey, can you do this? Can you please do that? It's orders are barked at me as if I'm the slave, and then they're barked even louder and angrier if I don't get up and go do what I'm being told to do. So There, no, I'm not dealing with any whippings. I'm not dealing with Africans that were back there. It's nowhere near as dramatic by any means, but it's and the slavery that does happen. It's I don't know how to explain it. All that could take away from it is there's no point in blaming all white people for slavery. All you do is create more resentment, more anger, blaming people who had nothing to do with anything, and just creating more enemies, creating contention where it doesn't need to be. Um, if a person, for instance, never met you, doesn't know who you are, has no issue with who you are, never has no true opinions towards you, but you go and say, "Oh, because you're this skin color, you were mean to my ancestors and you owe me money." Well, how do you think that person's gonna feel? Some white people have no problem bowing down and saying, "Oh, I'm so sorry for the sins of my ancestors," and some white people are like, "Bro, the fuck does that have to do with me today? What are you talking about?" I think it's that simple. Um, but yeah, that's where I'm at today. I want to point out I put it in the description in one of my past videos, but if anyone has any comments to leave, by all means. I don't really care if someone likes or subscribes, but if you have anything to say, anything of worth, or you want to make your voice heard, you feel free to leave a comment, and in my next video I'll do what I can to address your comment. Okay, so I might pop in later on today, and it might be tomorrow. Today seems to be a nice day coming up, so I want to go outside. So yeah, enjoy yours, I'm gonna enjoy mine. Be easy.